We swear and cuss, so if I say a swear word, I hope that's okay. But I'm smiling, certainly because I'm here. I want to thank William and Amanda for their generosity and their invitation. So I'm smiling for those reasons, but also because today is a special day, not only because it's Asian American Month, but the last day of it. But I bought a house this morning. So that's good, the American dream. But, yeah. And I'm also smiling because the last two lectures I gave, my children were with me, and they came up, and they kept bothering me. I said, girls, you have to go sit down. And I found out why they were pestering me 2 times in a row. One time in New York, and the second time last week in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Because I didn't tell the joke. So I'll tell my daughter's joke today for you. What has 5 eyes and cannot see?
Mississippi.
Mississippi River. So there you have it. I think William's taping, so I'll have to show Chloe that. Okay, I'd like to begin by just talking a little bit about critical race theory. Some of you in the audience might know a little, some might know a lot, some might know nothing. So just to get a temperature reading, give me a thumbs up if you've heard of this term at least. Okay. Okay. Raise your hand nice and tall and proud if you know quite a bit. Okay. And then raise your hand if you don't know anything, you've never heard of the term. Okay, great. I'm not going to really discuss critical race theory in a lot of detail, but I'd like to share this first slide, which is taken from Tara Yasso's article published in 2005, Whose Culture Has Capital, a critical race theory discussion of community and cultural wealth. And I think it goes nicely with the conversation I was having just a moment with Amanda. But critical race theory, there is an intellectual genealogy, right? Stemming from ethnic studies, and then if you go down, you can see critical race theory and the various branches. I'm going to really rely on Asian critical race theory, Asian crit, as we call it. So, as you can tell, there's fem crit, lat crit, tribal crit, and white crit. So, it's from there I'd like to depart with this evening's remarks. Okay. Critical race theory, I mean, you can get your PhD in critical race theory, study it. You can go to law school and critical legal studies. So I know we don't have that much time. But I will tell you, there are tenets, and I'm going to share 2 tenets with you. Okay. The first tenet, not very complex, it's simply the belief and idea that racism is ordinary. Right? Typically, folks, when something happens and they're like, oh, that's racist, they say, damn, that's bad. I'm like, yeah, it is bad. But it happens daily, right? It's not this aberrant, like, oh, that was racist. No, racism is ordinary and it functions within society. So that's the first tenet I want to share with you. The second tenet is Derek Bell's notion of silent covenants. And then within this umbrella term of silent covenants, racial sacrifice or racial sacrificial covenants, and interest convergence covenants. So I'm going to talk a lot about racism today. I'm going to talk a lot about these covenants. In particular, the second one, interest convergence. Okay? And I'll unpack what interest convergence is. I think we have a understanding what racism is for the most part. Okay, I just said that critical race theory believes, right, it has a tenet, it's foundational, it's a pillar. It's why critical race theory was developed. It's this notion that racism is ordinary. Okay, so what? What does that mean? Well, according to Robert Chang, an Asian crit, he says, to accept the myth of the model minority is to participate in the oppression of Asian Americans. Okay, So tonight's talk is going to be about racism. It's going to be about critical race theory, Asian crit specifically. But it's also going to be about the model minority stereotype, which some of us in the room may have heard, maybe you haven't, and I'll unpack what that is later. But it's from here I'd like to begin this discussion of the ordinariness, right? The everyday, the every town USA, right? There is not a state in the United States of America that doesn't have a race problem. Baltimore clearly has a race problem. The city, Maryland, the state, right? That problem has been there long ago. It's not just, it didn't happen overnight, right? Wichita, you have a race problem, and I have never, this is the first time I've been how many hours, Will? Like 3 hours? Yeah. You have a race problem, I can tell you already, right? So, I'd like to share, Ian Haney Lopez, he wrote an interesting and well-known book, When the Irish Became White. In his book, Dog Whistle Politics, he says this, and I quote, "Color blindness allows conservatives to insist that race means blood and nothing more. So that references to culture and behavior cannot be about race." Okay? I'm going to unpack this for us. But racism now, we have modern forms of racism. We don't have, we do have lynchings, believe it or not. But we don't have the form of racism we had back in the day. Right? Folks are not being strung up by the oak tree. We have different forms of racism. They're subtle, they're nuanced. And the biggest reason that the modern forms of racism are so complex and hard to understand is precisely we don't talk about race. So racism can be how we talk about race or how we do not talk about race in America, right? And this whole idea of I don't see color, I'm not talking about like I can't see his gold tie. That color blindness, that's real, right? The light spectrum, whatever, right? That color blindness exists. But real, true racial color blindness does not exist. I see all of your faces and I'm socially constructing your race as I'm speaking, right? Second, I will talk tonight about culture and behavior a lot. Because you see it in the media a lot, especially in Baltimore, what's going on. How they describe riots, how they describe civil disobedience, right? And that's really important to understand, right? Okay. I told William that tonight I'm going to do a series of storytelling, some stories. Critical race theory believes in stories, and they believe in counter stories, right? There's the dominant story, and then there's counter stories, okay? So I'm going to tell you a story briefly, okay? And I'm, being from Wisconsin, it hits close to home. I'll give my age away. In 2004, I was a sophomore in high school. I graduated. I'm sorry, I don't even know. Graduated. 2002. I'm 30. I'm 31. So right here, this city, Rice Lake. I'm tired. I'm sad. I bought a house. I don't even know when I graduated. Shit. Okay. Moving on. Rice Lake. Rice Lake on the map, right there in the northern part of Wisconsin. An incident happened in 2004. A Hmong American man, Chausa Vang. He was 36 at the time. He was accused of shooting 8 hunters, 6 of whom died, and all of whom were white men. Okay, so here you have a man in Thanksgiving weekend in 2004. You probably were watching football, and they were hunting, and an incident happened in the woods. Some white men were killed. What happened was Vang was sentenced to 6 life sentences. Okay. Now, let me tell you why I'm sharing this incident, and it'll blow your mind. Has anyone heard about this incident? Okay. If you have, don't spoil it, because there's some really racist implications here. The media was talking about Mr. Vang in ways that talked about his behavior and his culture. Didn't talk about race, right? Talked about culture behavior. You know, he's from Laos, and in Laos, you know, Hmong people, there's not private land. You can hunt wherever you want. Here in America, he was trespassing. He didn't know, right? All the men were killed. He's a violent person. He had military background, etc. The stories were talking a lot about culture. They never really mentioned his race per se, okay? So, right, culture and behavior cannot be about race. So therefore, if we talk about race and culture, we can't be racist. That's how racism works nowadays. We use different cultural markers to talk nasty about people. I gave a TED Talk. It actually stemmed, actually William and some other WSU students were at my home university, Illinois State, at a regional anthropological conference. And I had shared this work, and in my TED Talk I talk about talking nasty about Asians without sounding racist, right? And we talk nasty about racial groups, but we never have to use their race, okay? So following the hunting incident, right, Mr. Vang, according to Badillo, Mendy, and Ang in 2005, Custom Now, a store in Mankato, Wisconsin, carried bumper stickers that read, "Save a hunter, shoot a Hmong." Now, Hmong is not spelled M-U-N-G. Hmong is spelled H-M-O-N-G. It sounds the same, right? Hmong, Hmong. However, it was stated that Hmong, M-U-N-G, stood for minuscule, unseen, naughty ant, gnat. Right? Save a hunter, shoot a Hmong. So it's a little suspicious, right? You're in the deer stand and you're getting hit by gnats, right? You kill them, you want to kill these little gnats. I can see that. But the language is problematic to me because you don't shoot gnats. And there's this double entendre going on, right? This double, so it's a signifier. Clearly they're talking about Hmong people, Hmong Americans, right? That's highly racist, highly problematic. But it's funny, well, it's not funny, it's sad that the people who endorse these bumper stickers could deny that it was racist. Okay? It's not racist, right? That would be like saying, well, it's not racist to have bumper stickers of President Obama with fried chicken and Kool-Aid and watermelon, right? Which there are bumper stickers, right? So we can be racist without having to talk about race, okay? So let's talk about silent covenants. Derek Bell, a moment. He's since passed, but he is a well-renowned scholar, Harvard Law professor, and he talks about silent covenants. I mentioned there were two. There's racial sacrificial covenants and there's interest convergence covenants. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about interest convergence covenants, less so racial sacrifice covenants, but the definitions are there on the slide, right? Essentially, racial sacrificial covenants are policy decisions that sacrifice the freedom, interests of blacks to resolve differences of policymaking whites, such as protecting slavery and drafting the Constitution to ensure ratification by the southern states. Okay, so that's one example for racial sacrifice. Interest convergence works similarly but different. Interest convergence covenants simply are decisions in which the black rights are recognized and protected when and only so long as policy makers perceive that such advances will further interests that are in the whites' concern. So a good example of that, right, is desegregation of our schools in the United States, right? Brown v. Board, right? By desegregating, right, it served white interest convergence. There's a convergence of white interest because other countries at the time were looking, it was, right, a Cold War imperative. Well, how are you some beacon on the hill democracy and you guys have separate schools for your kids, right? And I tell my undergraduate students this, and they are perplexed. They say, Dr. Hartlep, how can our schools become more segregated when desegregation happened? They don't believe that, right? Which is true. Desegregation led to further segregation, hyper-segregation. And it's cognitive dissonance for my students, right? Maybe it's cognitive dissonance for you in the room, right? Like, how can that be? Well, for a variety of reasons. So I'm going to focus on interest convergence here. What is the model minority stereotype? According to Lee and Wong and Alvarez, they define the model minority stereotype as a stereotype of Asian Americans that promotes the image of Asian Americans as uniformly successful in terms of economic, educational, and social capital. Okay? Here's another definition, Kim's dictionary entry. She writes that it's a concept that implies that other minorities should emulate Asian Americans in their thought and behavior. There again, that behavior piece. In its purest sense, the model minority stereotype is the belief that Asian Americans do not suffer discrimination, are problem-free in many areas of their personal and professional lives, and are well integrated into dominant society. Right? It's false. Right? Certainly, there are Asian Americans who are doing well, prosperous, but to have a stereotype that uniformly says all Asians are really successful is problematic. Now, who are model minorities, right? Who are these Asian? And I apologize. Whenever I say Asian, I'm meaning, it can mean Asian. It can also mean Asian American, and any variation thereof. So I use the backslash. I don't hyphenate. Some of you might hyphenate. I don't do that because I believe in what Stanford professor Palumbo Lau talks about is this backslash. There's a hybridity. You have international folks who are Asian identity. You have actually people who are white, arguably, that have some affinity to Asia. So they're mixing. So there's hybrid identities, right? So I use the backslash. So whenever I say Asians, I'm meaning Asian Americans, Asians. That's what I'm referring to. But I am referring to something here. I see something going on. These are very common during the 80s. You would see magazine covers with these images, right? You have a lot of signifying going on, don't you? You have Stanford being signified, which is an elite private university. You have their race being signified. Because these folks, they look to me as if they're East Asian. I do not see a Southern Asian person. You have a Pacific Islander, perhaps, the Stanford gentleman, but a lot of the children, they're younger. And they're also in academic, the background is academic, right? Those pillars, which probably are Stanford's campus, and then the computer back in the day. Those are what the computers looked like back in the day, I guess. Right? And that was a joke. That's the best material I have for this evening. Okay? And you know, it's funny as hell because that guy in the back with the backpack, I have like a 4th grade picture and I look like him. I don't know where my looks went, but I used to be handsome. But, so you have this signifying going on, right? So that's important for us to understand who are Asians within this, you know, in our minds, right? In our mind's eye. Okay, so here's some more storytelling. I like to begin by, like, unpacking for a moment the stereotype. And it's genesis, it's birth, right? So I have a slide. This is the best I could get from microfiche, right? You know you're doing real research when you're using microfiche, right? Damn, that's a status symbol, right? So the microfiche of William Peterson's article. It was published in the New York Times Magazine, January 1966. And Peterson, you need to know a little bit about Peterson. He's a white man. He is a Berkeley sociologist. Okay? I would love to have said he's an anthropologist. That would be lying. He's a sociologist. But, so he's at Berkeley, and he wrote this piece, Success Story, Japanese American Style. Okay? And I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version. Japanese are doing well, blacks are not doing so well. It's the culture. Oh, another term, right? Culture, I said it again. It's the culture of Japanese. Despite being interned, they're doing well, etc., etc. My story isn't over. Hasn't begun yet. Because all stories are told in relation to other stories. So let me tell you another story. Context matters in stories, right? It always matters, right? In the US, I'm going to share you a context. A year before Peterson's story, so I said 1966, January, a year before, almost to the day, I believe. It might even be like 11 months, I'm not sure, but a year. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then Assistant Secretary of Labor, publishes a scathing report, The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. If you were to Google or Wikipedia this, you would find it referred to as the Moynihan Report. Moynihan's report, let me give you the Cliff Notes version of that. Black culture is why they have problems with crime, they're not being successful, it's a black welfare queen, this whole notion of deterioration of family values and civic engagement. Okay? Why is that important? Well, I just told you in '66 there's this story, Japanese folks, you're doing really well. The year before there's a story, blacks are not doing well because of your culture. Is someone seeing the implications here? It racially triangulated Asian Americans, blacks, and whites. What do I mean by that? Well, using Claire Jean Kim's work on racial triangulation, she has this schematic. And she really does a nice job showing how, in America, our racial paradigm is black and white. There's a spectrum, and then where do Asian people fall? There's this famous article, are Asians black or white, right? And so the racial triangulation piece has an added layer to it, though. So it's not just simply about race, it's also about insider-outsider studies. Right? So you have blacks who are supposedly inferior on the racial hierarchy. They have been and they still are, right? And white superior. And then middleman, the Asian Americans are middlemen. However, there's something different about Asian Americans, right? It's like, are you really American? You're like this perpetual foreigner, right? And so you're a foreigner and blacks and whites are insiders. So racial triangulation is very important to understand in the model minority stereotype because the stereotype was created to divide and conquer. The ulterior motive of Peterson's story is insidious. Some of you don't believe me, you will after I show the next slide. Again, my story is only beginning. Now consider this for a moment. Consider this for a moment. This is a direct quote taken from Daryl Hamamoto's book, Monitored Peril. Right? And I quote, shortly after the publication of The Negro Family, that's the Moynihan Report, right, 1965, Professor William Peterson was asked by the editor of the New York Times Magazine to write an article on a distinct racial group that had also suffered past discrimination, yet did not seem to be troubled by a breakdown in family life. Right? Because I said the Moynihan said, hey, black families, you're falling apart. Japanese families, you're doing great, right? The group happened to be Japanese Americans. Now, I bolded this because it is crazy. When I read this, I was just floored. Peterson himself admitted that he had little personal and absolutely no professional experience that qualified him to expound upon the subject matter. But he undertook the assignment nonetheless. So not only do you got a problematic, ulterior motive to publishing this, you've got a person who's really not qualified to even write the damn story. That would be like me coming to give the lecture and I'm like, hey, did you hear about that model minority stereotype? Yeah, me either. I've never heard of it. Right? That's just ludicrous. It's loony. Okay, I'm not done yet. The model minority myth, I want to suggest tonight that it's a racial idea. Okay, very simple, right? It's a racial idea. I'm citing Ian Haney Lopez again here from the Dog Whistle Politics. Racial ideas perpetually adapt to reassure members of the dominant group that, however unjust the social arrangements and whatever the intended violence, they are good and decent folks. That is a racial idea. If you don't know who the dominant group in this country is, dominant group are cisgendered men, Christian with money. Okay, that's just the normative group, fundamental, right? In the social foundations of education class, you would learn that that's a normative group. That's the dominant group we're talking about. Okay, why is this important? And how does it fit? I was trying to wrap my head, I said, what is something that I could just blast and people would just rise up out of the seat in the lecture. I'm glad there's people here. That would just be like, oh my God, you're making that up. Like, just light your hair on fire. So this is the best I can come up with. Drapetomania. Drapetomania was a racial idea during slave times. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, he came up with this term, and basically it meant was this. If you are a slave and you try to run from your slave master, you're insane. He was a medical physician who was like, damn. Now, if I was a slave, my ass would be running as fast as I could to get the hell out of there, right? And I would not be insane. But that was a racial idea back in the day, right? We have racial ideas right now, right? Is this whole notion of like homosexuals, that's not normal, right? That is a racial idea, and if you believe that, we can talk after, right? But this is crazy because the dominant group at the time, slave owners, they have to rationalize their behavior in some way, right? And so, it doesn't matter how unjust chattel slavery was, Samuel Cartwright, contributes to this notion, right? Here's another, cartographers. Cartographers perpetuate racial ideas. Look at the size of Africa. If you haven't read anything about Arnold Peterson, about maps, take a look at his work, about his projection, right? But maps say a lot. If you look at a map in the U.S., you're going to see U.S. plumb in the middle, big and important. And then you're going to see Africa small. Right? But the fact of the matter is, Africa is big, black, and beautiful. Right? Right? And important. And important. Right? The news media perpetuates racial ideas. We already saw the magazine covers of the Asian, East Asian people, right? I think of Malcolm X, who, believe it or not, had extreme loyalty and ties to the Asian American community. When he was assassinated, a Japanese sister was right next to him, cradling him, while he bled to death. Malcolm X said this: if you are not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. Man. The next is a clip I'm going to show you about television entertainment spreading racial ideas.
Have you guys noticed how many Asians there are at this school? Like, how do they all get so smart?
I don't know. Guess that's just the way God made them.
Gentlemen, I give you the Asian. Ooh. Compact, hairless, and fiercely intelligent. The penises, while tiny, are extremely efficient. We're projecting 10 billion within 5 years. Also, there'll be different varieties that will all hate each other for some reason.
Do they eat just like regular food?
No, the opposite.
So, Family Guy. Television entertainment, racial ideas, right? The notion that Asian men have small genitalia, they're smart, the nerdy glasses, right? Hairless, right? All of that. But that slide and this slide are connected. And anthropologists, you're not off the hook. I'm going to put you on the hook right now. Some of you, your predecessors, is that eugenics has, right, supported and spread racial ideas. Down syndrome. I'm sure all of us have heard Down syndrome, right? It was named after Dr. Down, who did the work. Before it was named Down syndrome, though, it was actually called Mongolism, Mongol idiocy. Mongolia, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, Negroid, eugenics, cultural anthropologists. Okay? So here you have this trace. The penis length, that's tied to eugenics too. Because believe it or not, you can read articles in peer-reviewed journals by eugenicists, Canadian eugenicists, talking about penis length and intelligence. And according to their research, Asian men, small penis, high intellect. Black men, large, long penis, low intelligence, and where were white men? Right there in the middle. You're the normative group again. You had average intellect and average penis size, okay? It's crazy, isn't it? But it is important to see and decipher where the origins come from. That's why we're critical race theorists say, you know, racism's ordinary. We haven't become post-racial, right? And it's important that we understand this concept of racial ideas. Hollywood spreads racial ideas. If you didn't know, now you know.
Shows that in my America. Did you see the way he looked at the truck? It's like race burner this, Jap burner that, you know? How many swamp rats can get in one room? And have some respect, Zipperhead. Yeah, my better. Chinks have proven in his neighborhood for. I kept a bunch of jabbering gooks off of my lawn. When we were in Korea and 1,000 screaming gooks came across our line, we didn't call the police. Yeah, well, you shouldn't be hanging out with them. You should be hanging out with your own people, the other Hmongs. What is it? Jungle people wanting to be in the great frozen time.
Kill people.
What are all you fish heads looking at anyway? These gooks enacted my own spoiled, rotten family. Relax, Zipperhead. You're wrong, April. I know exactly what I'm talking about. You let Click Clack Ding Dong and Charlie Chan just walk out with Miss What's-Her-Face. You mean York? Yeah, yeah. Nice girl. I chose him to marry these Monroes are like badgers. All you slopes are supposed to be good at math, right? You swamp rats, on the other hand, you just now listen to me, Sid. Now you listen, old man. Look, I'm just kidding, Sid. You get the wrong one, he's gonna blow your gook head right off. Now, come on, Zipperhead. Let the big stay here. We're going to kill that cousin of yours and the rest of those zips. Take it on a cheap machine gun nest. Yeah, some scared little goop just like you. These swamp rats in there. Shut up, goop. Give me another beer, Dragon Lady.
So the repetition, right, of Hollywood, right? We have cultivation theory, right, that says, right, when you watch television, you internalize this. How many times, right? We count that. But notice, he never really said any racial terms. He used epithets, racial epithets, certainly. But in terms of the repeated use, that's problematic. And that it spreads a racial idea. You know, the Hmong shooting story I just shared, and then here is one of the first, I would believe, first Hollywood movie that really portrayed Hmong folks of color on the big screen. So the racial ideas and the model minority stereotype, everything I've talked about thus far, is right playing into this notion of the danger of a single story. So if the story about Asian Americans in the United States is success, the single story of blacks as cultural inferiority, those two stories support, they're mutually reinforcing, and they support white supremacy. And I think of Plato, who said, those who tell the stories also hold the power. Right? And I think of the parable, or the parable, not parable, the expression of history will not change until the gazelle starts writing it, right? Because it's always told from the lion. Right? The lion eats the gazelle, the lion writes the story, there is the history. And that's why stories are so important. Asian American stories, counter stories, right? Who has the power tells the story. And that's why this is important. Those weren't my words. They were the words of Dr. Adichie, whose TED Talk, right? The danger of a single story. Some of you may have listened to that TED Talk. But this quote just sums it up so well. How stories are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. They really are dependent on power. That is why my college students have a hard time understanding why Christopher Columbus was a bad person. And all of the other stock stories the dominant group tells us. And the dominant group tells us that Asians are successful. And I'm going to fight to say that that is problematic. The model minority stereotype is a racial idea, and it is a silent covenant. Remember, silent covenant, white interest convergence. Because that is precisely why the Times, New York Times Magazine approached Peterson and said, look, we need you to write a story about a racial cultural group that is doing well in the United States. The reason they needed that story is because of racial hostility and tension. What would happen if that story was never produced? Well, the masses would have a difficult time believing that in America, the American dream is possible. If I just worked hard enough, right? In America, we blame the victim, we blame the individual, and we are reluctant to look at institutions, right? That really channel us into our outcomes in life, right? We could talk about the reasons why Asian Americans supposedly look good on paper, which we will get to as sophistry in a second. But it's really important that we understand that it is racist to believe into the stereotype, and also that it supports, right, the interest of the dominant group. Why did I put these check marks? I was fancy because I don't usually make fancy PowerPoints here. I was playing on the airplane. But this signifies that we don't talk about race anymore. We replace it with culture. So the check, we use culture, right? So I love when I hear people that say this. You might have heard it. I'm not racist, but yeah, you are. You're racist. Sorry. Yes, you. Yep. If you use that, you are racist. I have an Asian friend. Yep, I know where that's going. The cultural signifiers, right? You might hear people say, oh, of course they're going to do well. They're Korean, or their mom, yeah, is Chinese. Well, she'll be fine. Or this whole tiger parenting thing, violin playing, right? Problematic, right? And behavior, right? This whole idea of how Asians are supposedly supposed to behave. There's a powerful chapter in one of these books, one of my books, talking about nail salon workers, Korean nail ladies, right? And there's an interesting Seinfeld episode when Elaine goes in and she's getting her nails done, and she's like really stressed because she's like, what are they talking about? Because they're talking in Korean, and they think, oh, right? And it just shows, right, this whole compliance and docility, right? That Asians are docile and, oh, I'm here to pamper you and make you feel good and paint your nails, right? Don't worry about buying me, right? And in the chapter they talk about the Korean ladies, they don't eat kimchi because the white patrons don't like the smell, right? So behavior is really important. Well, the model minority stereotype preserves colorblind and meritocratic ideology, right? In this country, the colorblindness is this notion of, well, it shouldn't matter your race, you should just become successful because you work hard. And we'll forget that, right? We've had a head start from day one, right? Right? And also understanding that the stereotype, beyond the academic nerdy type and the geek, right? There are certain stereotypes, the gook stereotype. There's the exotic, right? There's the yellow fever stereotype of Asian women, right? There's the emasculation of Asian American men, right? Their penis size, they're hairless. Somehow in America, dominant culture says you must have a large penis, I guess, and be hairy to be a man. So somehow we're going to emasculate Asian men, and now you're just a kung fu fighter, and you can't be intelligent, right? So it's a constellation of stereotypes, right? The engineering nerds, among others. But the biggest thing I want to emphasize today is the emphasis that these stereotypes render Asian Americans invisible, right? And so you would think that's a contradiction. Maybe that's some postmodern thought, post-structural thought that your hyper-visibility can be invisible, right? But it's true, right? Because you're the token minority. You're used when it is in the best interest of the dominant group. So right now, like I said, we don't have this type of racism nowadays. Right? I don't think I see any of you with these proud badges emblazoned on your sweaters that, right, jack hunting license, etc. Right? We're more skilled and adept at concealing our racism. Right? Historically and even contemporarily, we do have discursive violence towards Asian people, right? Like this ad, I think this was a some food ad. Did you ever see a fat Chinese? Basically the rice, trying to emphasize rice and being healthy, etc. That's problematic because it over-essentializes Asianness. That somehow to be Asian means white rice. You see these chopsticks, right? They're fortune cookie, even though Asian people never created fortune cookies, right? So it's very problematic. A reason that this work is so important is I talked about racial ideas, which are hard to wrap our head around. But also, what's hard to wrap our head around is discourse, because discourse lacks physical evidence, right? So the current model minorities, there is one crucial difference in this modern system. In very problematic ways, the nature of hegemony differs between minority groups. Because it's predominantly discursive in nature, meaning lacking physical proof of the ideology, the model minority system is presented as apolitical, right? So color blindness is a form of apoliticalness. You know, I teach, all my students want to become teachers, K-12. And if I got a penny for every time I heard this, I wouldn't be lecturing here and I would be retired over with the Koch brothers in their mansion. But I would hear things like this. They would say, Dr. Hartlep? I say, yes. It doesn't matter if my kids are black or brown or green. I'm going to treat them all the same. I'm like, great. I don't know any green students. I know black students and white students, but right, they're buying into this discourse. By saying that, I can't be accused of being racist, right? And that's why we use semantic moves, right? I'm not racist, but to alleviate that tension, because in America, we don't like to talk about race. It makes us feel uncomfortable, unless you're a professor. All right, so if you like to talk about race, go get your PhD. No. Okay, let's get into sophistry for a moment. Modern forms of anti-Asian violence, racism, right, they're enacted through sophistry. And sophistry is simple to comprehend. It's just the use of reasoning or arguments that sound correct but are actually false. Right? The climate change people, I think they got some sophistry going on. They're like, no, the ice caps aren't melting. Okay, so in some of my current and ongoing work, I've really trying to develop this notion of racial sophistry and model minority sophistry because, first off, I use the term, but I don't like it precisely, model minority myth, because myth seems hokey to me. It's like mythical, okay? Yeah, that sounds sexy for like a Disney movie, but for us, scholars, right? So I like the term stereotype, but then now I'm like, I don't know about stereotype because stereotypes are embedded with our own understandings and misperceptions and perceptions. Sophistry really gets at the heart of it because a lot of the arguments that are used, right? Stereotypes, believe it or not, they're grounded in some form, a kernel of truth, right? There's a kernel of truth there. So sophistry. So let me give you some sophistry examples. Right? There is a myth in this country that Asian Americans, Asians, score high in the SAT. Right? SAT test. I should have just said SAT scores because I repeated the T test, but the SAT scores. Because, in fact, according to the National Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Research and Education, Asian Americans have the largest dispersion rate for SAT scores. What this means is that Asian American students have the widest standard deviation for any racial group. In other words, among Asians and APIs, there are higher numbers of scores that deviate from the mean score than is true for other racial groups. So Asian Americans don't abide by a normal curve. They're bimodally distributed. So if you're not a statistician, quantitative inclined, it simply means there's a lot on the high end and a lot on the low end, right? And so they're not uniformly, if they were scoring off the top out of the water, right, they would be on the high end. There's also a myth of Asians have this high educational attainment, right? Well, this graph illustrates, right? If you're on the blue side, less than high school diploma, that means you have low levels of educational attainment. If you're on the right-hand side, that means bachelor's degree or higher, right? That if you disaggregate Asian Americans, you're going to see differentials in educational attainment. And there's a variety of explanations for why some subgroups are doing better than others. It has to do with money, it has to do with immigration status, it has to do with racism, it has to do with a host of reasons. So,
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you know how a lot of Pacific Islanders will segregate themselves from the rest of the East Asian people because, for example, the two humps in the SAT scores, a lot of the East Asian people will do a lot better than some of the Southeast Asian and the Pacific Islanders. What do you think of those types of groups segregating themselves out of what traditional Asian American, I guess, how other people see them as?
I am sorry, I was trying to double multitask. That's evidence multitasking does not work. So I have no clue what you said, so lay it on me again.
Okay, so like the two, well, I just know that a lot of Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders will not call themselves Asian American because of things like that, because they want resources that are dedicated towards people who are lower income and lower education level.
You're absolutely right. You're an expert actually, because a lot of people don't. Yeah, I don't, myself included. So we have these political terms like AAPI,
Yeah.
even Asian. I could just call it Asian American History Month, Heritage Month, but the White House calls it whatever. Pacific Islanders really, there's strong cases why they shouldn't be lumped in with Asian Americans. And I could talk after about the reasons, but same with Filipinos, right? Because of the Spanish colonization. So you're absolutely right, there are some that don't. I personally, I just use this because that's what they cite. They use that AAPI. But yeah, there are reasons why we shouldn't treat them together.
So if you only have the Asian people who are doing really well and have high educational aspirations, and you have these stereotypes, and they say, well, but it's true, then, what happens next after that?
Yeah, well, I think that's the incorrect attitude to have, because we need to see how oppression works interlocking with other forms of oppression, meaning it's not us versus them, it's not a zero-sum game. Racism actually hurts white people, if you didn't know. So it's, and there's a lot of interesting research about that. But when we disaggregate this, there is a problem of essentializing. I know I'm getting off topic, so I'll just wrap it up. That in the process of doing disaggregated research, what happens is Southeast is kind of like the reference group, right? When you do stats, it's like, who do you compare, right? And they become the low comparative group. And that's problematic. I find that problematic. They have unique, when we look at the subgroups, they have all unique needs, right? And Sam Macias, professor, I believe he's at Boston, he talks about Asian Americans are like the only minority group that we have to like assert that we're oppressed, right? It's like most black people are like, damn, like, it's like, yeah, you're racist. You hate black people, you're right, you're English only movement, you don't like Latino people. But Asians somehow, ironically, we have to fight that, we're over here and yes, we are oppressed. Oh yeah, we need affirmative action, right? So it's unique, right? And that's precisely how sophisticated the stereotype is, right? To shield itself. So I want to kind of wrap up things by saying, because I know I got 5 minutes, how can Asian Crit help us understand anti-Asian racism? Well, silent covenants, we have to understand things through a socio-political, political economy lens. Right? There's there is a YouTube video, The Space Traders, if you haven't seen it. It's a parable, but it talks about what would happen if aliens came down and said, look, we will give you gold and we'll clean all your pollution if you give us all your black people. And it's kind of like this counter narrative of like, well, what did the president, cabinet, and politicians do? Did they say, no, you can't give, that's horrible, we can't just give you, right? And all of the arguments they made. So that illustrates, right, how racism works. Certainly we need to know about sophistry. We need to debunk, right, sophistry. If an argument seems logical, right, it's going to be hard to right, argue that it's incorrect, but we have to. That happens in the college classroom, it happens in the community, happens in your own spaces, right? Also, we need to think about racial ideas, right? Ian Haney Lopez and Dog Whistle, right? Politics, how racial ideas, they insulate themselves from being debunked, right? It's like a chimera. You cut the head off and then a new head forms, right? Certainly in the toolbox, Asian Crit toolbox, we have counter stories which really push back against dominant narratives, or stock stories as they're called. Asian Crit theorizes from a standpoint, right? It's a standpoint theory. That's why we have Asian Crit, Tribal Crit, Lat Crit, because the argument is, right, the Latino reality is slightly nuanced compared to the Asian reality, slightly nuanced to the Native American reality. However, right, I don't want to isolate us further into these silos. That's not to say, right, and you might have heard the term oppression sweepstakes, like, well, we're more victimized than you, and you know. No, that's why I'm saying racism affects everyone, white people included. But from the standpoint, we have intersectional approaches, intersectionality. We also have phenomenological, right? This notion that you've had to have the experience to talk about it. And then certainly we have racial triangulation at play, which is really important because we need to move outside of this binary of black and white, right, with the Asian American. Lastly, Asian Crit certainly is an approach that debunks anti-Asian racist sophistry because it says, what? The first tenet I said, it said racism is ordinary. Because the dominant group, dominant society wants you to think that we are post-racial, right? Obama ushered in a time when we're post-racial. You know, it's interesting. Did we ever have an Asian American president? Have we ever had a woman president? There's surveys that show, that survey white people, that they would vote for a black president before they would vote for an Asian president. And that's for a variety of reasons. This whole suspicious, this how can an Asian American really lead the country? And also that they would vote for a woman over an Asian. So that tells me what? We already had Obama, or we have Obama, and maybe we'll have a Clinton or someone else. Hopefully not Sarah Palin. And I'm sorry, it's not a roast. And then we'll have our Asian American, right? And I didn't tell you about my identity. I'm adopted, so I'm not naturally born, so I don't think I could ever be president because you have to be a natural born citizen, so, and pretty wealthy, so two things I don't have. But that's kind of what I wanted to wrap it up, and then if there is time, William or Amanda, to engage in any question and answer. If not,
we have 30 more minutes.
Oh, we have 30 more minutes? Perfect. So I did my spiel, now you get to talk back to me.